for coming. We have hopefully what will be a really educational, informational programming this evening and a great opportunity to have conversation, talk to some folks who are just outstanding in our circuit at concept design and development, and learn a little bit about what their processes are. I know we all have unique processes to what we do and how we do it. So just learning about everyone and what makes them successful and unique can always give us all insight into our way and our new ways as we develop and grow. So thank you again for being here. And I want to especially thank our presenters this evening. So I am Shannon, and I will not be presenting, but I will be facilitating as the Education Director of Tri-State Marching Art. We have with us Bethany Paisley, who is with Grant County Color Guard, who is a 2022 and 2023 Tri-State Marching Arts Scholastic A2 Silver Medalist, and just put out some outstanding programs in the last couple years with some really unique concept development. We also have joining us as a panelist Doug Wash, Director of Ryle High School, and he's on staff at Milford High School. So Ryle was our WGI 2023 Scholastic A finalist, and we have Milford High School, who is WGI 2023 Scholastic Open Bronze medalist. And then we have with us Jessie Price, the Director of Magnolia Project, and they are 2023 Independent A Silver medalists. So she's in Vegas representing our circuit at that Tri-State board meeting this week, so we appreciate that. I'm sorry, the WGI board meeting, and also Doug will be going out tomorrow to represent Tri-State at our WGI board meeting. So we're so proud of the accomplishments of all these folks and what they bring to our circuit. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to go through a round of some questions where I'll ask our panelists to talk to us a little bit about their processes and their thoughts on some things, and then we'll wrap up in about 40 minutes with some opportunities for y'all to ask some questions and things like that. If you do have questions, please drop them in the chat. At any time, we'll try to get to those at the end. And if you don't mind to keep your mic muted just so that we don't have a lot of feedback, we appreciate that too. So again, thanks for joining us. So let's get started here. If we were in a real conference with live people, we would give these people a huge round of applause upon their introductions. So let's go ahead and do that. Thank you. So I want to start with a conversation where we'll begin with Doug. And he's going to tell us a little bit about one of his favorite shows that he's created. He's going to share a little bit about his timeline for planning a Winter Guard show and deciding on that show idea, how to finalize costumes, flag, soundtrack, etc. And after Doug, we'll hear from Bethany, and then we'll hear from Jessie. So Doug, let's turn it over to you.
I am going to attempt to share my screen. You guys are going to get to see all of you first, I believe. Are you guys able to see my screen?
It's blurry, but yes.
How about now? Better?
Maybe it's just my screen.
Okay, well, we'll talk through it, and I can always post this for everybody to see. We are trying to record the meeting, but in a little bit of a funky way, so we're going to do our best here. So obviously this season was super incredible for both Milford and Ryle, so both shows kind of hold a special place in my heart, and for very different reasons. So a lot of those reasons have to do with kind of the process that we've put together at both places, and both places really we try to kind of mirror each other in what we're doing, at least I do. And so this is kind of how we progress through that. So my first document here is kind of like a schedule that we try to adhere to keep us on track. So we typically, as a staff, will meet at the end of the season. So in this one, you can see that we actually met after the TMA spring meeting. We had a staff meeting, and we kind of go through what went well, what didn't go well, how we address those things, how we continue to maintain those things, etc. What do we plan to achieve in the next season, and how do we get there? So kind of goal setting. Do we need additional tech exercises, alterations to those tech exercises, that kind of progression? More or less shows, more WGI regionals, just kind of a whole holistic view of kind of how the season went. From there, we're constantly really, as a staff, sending ideas back and forth, sending music back and forth throughout really the entire year. My text messages blow up daily with new music. But really, by September 1st, we're trying to narrow that down to just a few options and kind of starting to flush those handful of ideas out. And then we give ourselves that month of September to do that, weigh the pros and cons, meet back and forth, and discuss them, the ideas with them, where they would go, things like that. And then we try really by the beginning of October to have a show selected. And then what we do from there is really start to build upon that. So we start building prop prototypes, beginning the uniform sketches and design, and getting a sample of that, beginning on graphic designs for any props we need, any floor we need, obviously the lovely social media graphics that everybody puts out now on their accounts. And then at that point, we really start to work through the music edits, and I'll talk through more of that here in just a little bit. But that's kind of all of the month of October for us. In the heat of marching band, we're also in the heat of kind of trying to nail everything down. And then the goal typically is by the beginning of November to have our floor ordered and our costumes ordered. We have a really great connection to some companies that have really great production times, so we can order those, when we need them for the season. From there, we have, it's a little different every year depending on BOA and things that are happening. For example, Ryle went to Hawaii in December, and so we kind of had to really adjust. We would typically take a week or two off right after marching band, and we didn't have the time for that because of Hawaii. So we kind of went straight into it. I think we left the field at State. The next Tuesday we were up doing auditions, and then a week later we had our first staging camp. But in a typical year, we're doing mid to late November staging camp, then another one at some point in December, and then another one in early January, depending on how that goes and if it's needed. And then from that point, we really work as a staff managing it throughout the season, right? And we try to communicate back and forth for every rehearsal, things we want to adjust, make better, things like that. But we really try to put the edits to the show from a pacing, staging, whatever it may be, choreography. We really try to put a cap on those by mid-March, I'd say. Kind of obviously depends on how late the season goes. So that we can really start to switch that focus over from the development of the show to cleaning and getting it ready for the final push. We have a list, and this is really small, so I'm going to zoom in. My apologies. Of kind of things that we're always discussing, things that we're always trying to keep in mind. So the first one is, what are or were the trends in finals the prior year for the class? Part of the reason that last year's Ryle show was so special to me was that we had not really participated in WGI before. We had never really competed on a national stage to that level. And so the year prior, my assistant director Chase and I, we went to A-class finals. We sat through all of Independent A and all of Scholastic A, and we took notes on our phone, obviously, but we sat there and we took notes. We counted how many kids were in each group, and then we found the average of that. Did every group have rifle? Did every group have saber? What was kind of the split of that? How many were on weapon versus flag versus not spinning at all? What was kind of the trend of shows, whether it was slow or fast, pretty or fun, those types of things. What are common skills that we were were seeing in movement and what were common skills that we were seeing in equipment. And so when we sat there and we took all of that away, we would take that and go to our end of the season meeting and kind of use all of that to develop our plan to help ourselves ensure that we were taking ourselves where we wanted to go. The second question that we always ask is, what is our brand? And is our brand working, or is it expandable? So a long time ago, someone always told me that you can always change, but you should stick to your brand for at least a couple of years and create your identity, if you will. And so we kind of like to define our identity and what that is, and then determine whether or not it's working or not, and if we should alter that or if we should continue with that. What do the kids connect to and excel at? So the important thing is really knowing your kids and knowing what emotionally, mentally, physically they're going to be able to achieve and what they're going to buy into. If they're not buying into it, you're never going to find success, regardless of how great it's staged or how much you're developing. Next one is, what are we good at as a staff? So everybody's different. I think I'm going to relate this to Bethany. I think Bethany is really great at shows that I'm not great at. For example, that toxic show would never fit something in my wheelhouse because that's not who we are as a staff, right? Not that it's a bad thing or a good thing. It's just knowing your identity of who you are and what you're able to achieve. And that's totally in her wheelhouse. She excels at that so much. But knowing that is why she was able to find success for her group, and I was able to find success for my group. So the note that I always tell my staff is, for the kids to excel, we must also connect and excel. So if it's not something that we can't buy into, that we're not going to be able to write our best at or stage our best at, that it's probably not something that we should look at. This one is a big one. This one is actually one of my notes. I wear multiple hats, obviously, so my president hat comes on a lot. But I always have this in the back of my mind, is what is the minimum time required for show and equipment in that specific class? It's in both the Tri-State Policy Manual and the WGI Manual. We match, obviously. But knowing those two things is really important. So if the show that you're developing and that you're deciding on is not long enough, how can we successfully extend that show to meet those time requirements? Does the show have peaks and valleys? This is a big one. We go back and forth as a staff on this all of the time when we're working to select a show and in the design process. So obviously, you feel those peaks and valleys naturally, I think, when you listen to any song, the highs and the lows. And they're important in the development of a show, especially in the A class, the A2 class, the regional A classes. And judges are looking for those, right? I can't tell you how many times I've heard the word peaks and valleys on judges' tapes. So it's okay if it's not there, but if it's not evident, you have to have a plan for those, right? And you have to be able to create those peaks and those valleys, whether it's missing peaks or it's missing valleys. How do you plan ahead of time to account for that in the design process? What are our big moments? What are our big moments, but how do we get into and out of those big moments? The transition is often more important than the big moment. A poor transition leads to judges to talk about those, and oftentimes they end up talking about those through the entire big moment that you spent all of your time on. So how do you make those transitions seamless? For us, that's kind of my last point, so I'll switch over to kind of like what we do. For us, a lot of that process is I'm trying to figure out how to get off of this. A lot of that process is free flowing. So what we like to do is have a set idea of kind of where we see our big moments, but we actually spend a majority of our time crafting editing the moments leading into. I can remember getting extremely frustrated at one of our staging camps in November where we were spending, I think we spent 4 hours on like 16 plus 8, right? But it was the 16 and 8 that was going to lead into a big moment. And so getting into that big moment means more sometimes than the actual big moment. But a lot of that we do free flowing, right? So what feels well? If we're writing something and we're really liking where it's going, we are developing an idea and working, through that process, and we need more time. We'll often allow ourselves that time. Do we need to go back to the music? Arranger, the editor, whoever it is, ourselves, whatever it is that you're using, and add more time into that moment, if possible, to extend that because of how important some of those lead-ins are. The last note, I think, really is working that I want to make is working your soundtrack to what you need, right? I think there was actually a WGI proposal, it may have been last year, to reduce the show requirements because somebody put a ton of information out there on how 75, like 80% of all new songs coming out are under what our minimum time requirements are as an activity. And it's becoming extremely hard to just, find a song off of YouTube or iTunes and make that your show, right? You're having to do a bunch of editing and stuff like that. And so I think finding resources for that is always a challenge, but there are tons of systems out there that you can use on your own. And you don't have to be a pro. I do a ton of it, honestly, for ourselves. I just went out to YouTube and looked at how to use GarageBand. I have a Mac, so how to use GarageBand, right? And kind of following those YouTubes and teaching myself and making that flow happen for us. And there are also a ton of options out there for soundtrack editors. And it seems like it's an added cost, super expensive, but they really do quality work. And to be honest, they're really not that expensive. I can I'll just give you my information. We at Ryle and Milford both used a professional engineer to create our soundtrack, and that engineer charged us $500. They did a ton of editing up front, but that $500 included any and all edits that we needed throughout the season, right? So our show, the actual song, was only like 3 minutes, and we ended up at 5 minutes by the end of all of it. So that engineer was putting like 2.5 minutes almost into it, plus fixing quality and clarity of vocals and things like that, so that when it's playing through the loudspeakers, it's coming through crystal clear. So yeah, lots of information there, but that's kind of the process that we go through in our selection of a show, if you will.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Doug. It's very informational. We're going to pass it on to Bethany, and if Bethany could just talk us through some of the same process. And, Doug is working in Scholastic A and Scholastic Open. Bethany's working in Scholastic A2. So we're going to hear a different perspective.
Hello. So I will say that I do not have anything to share, like anything. But I'd say that my timelines are a little different just because I don't have a big staff like a lot of people do. So I kind of do everything on my own. I do design, I do drill, I kind of do everything, music, everything. So I'm just going to start off with my favorite show and how I created that and everything. So my favorite show that I've ever created was actually our past 2023 winter season, which was at Grant County. I felt like the students helped bring the story to life. They really enjoyed the show, and they really did their research to try to make the show enjoyable for not just themselves but for the audience. I made a lot of notes. So, sorry. When starting the process of creating my next show, I know I always want to start, like, I always want to have kind of something dark and something different. I know sad and happy are always like the good things, but I like the dark and the creepy. And those are always my go-to kind of shows. So whenever I start like trying to find a show to do, I just kind of listen to different genres. I'll even go and listen to like different rock bands and stuff. Or I'll listen to covers of our different shows or like different songs that like I think are really popular, but I can always find like different covers that are like darker and deeper. Whenever I go and listen to that, my husband's usually listening with me, and he'll be like, "Oh, why don't you do this kind of show?" And we'll always like something like that, and he'll give me like 5 ideas, and I'll like try to narrow it down from there. Whenever I do find a song, I to create just like a vague storyline. I don't really ever have a set story until almost like the last day of winter season. I stay within, like, to have my show concept done about, I'd like to have my show concept by mid-August, just because I have a lot to do on my end on top of everything else. If I ever need props or backdrops or whatever I need for the shows, I try to have those, at least researching them, or like if I need to build them or if I need to buy them. I try to have that done by September, end of September at the very latest, just so that I can get my materials and get my budget going for winter. This past winter, we actually bought barrels from like Facebook Marketplace for like $10, and it was great. Once I figure out props and stuff like that, I start looking into uniforms about the same time at the end of September. I usually I don't really like choose anything like too crazy or anything. I just kind of scroll through Creative Costuming or FJM or wherever we're going to order from for the season, and I can just create something from that. And if it's out of my budget, I just try to make my budget and see what I can change, or if like I can contact the designers and we can get it within budget. But I always try to have my uniforms by our first show, which I know is very hard, but it's pretty easy. Like, as long as you know your timeline, I always try to get my deposit in by November, and that's very helpful. Whenever I find my soundtracks that I know that I want to use for the season, and like we were saying, like if it's too short, you always have to expand it because the minimum at this point is always at least 4 minutes or longer. But you always want to find a song that you feel that you can always like, and if you do. So like this past season, I knew I wanted to have an emergency broadcast at the beginning of my show. And I know that's very abrupt and it's very crazy, but I knew it was something I wanted to do, and I got it in. It was like the first thing I did before I even started mixing my soundtrack. It was like, I was like, I know I want this, and it was a raw edit and it was rough, but I put it in. Great. When you're also creating the soundtrack, I always like to think of like how you want your show to flow. So I always I'm constantly watching guard shows like on YouTube and everything, and I've always watched, like, anytime I can watch, I just sit down and watch every class I can just to get a feel for anything I can. And there's always the basic, like you start with dance, you move to a piece of equipment, you do a big hit, you do another piece of equipment, you do a big hit, and you have a strong ending. And that's something that you just always, like, you just want to have your base always for that. I don't have like any documents or anything to share, but I kind of just do everything on notebook paper. But yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Bethany. And we really appreciate you sharing all the information. I think it's like we see some really common themes between what people working in different classes and some of the things that they do to pull inspiration and things that are super important to them, especially about connecting to their music and making sure their students connect to the music, because that always seems to be a theme in creating a really strong buy-in for your entire team's product. But great, that's wonderful. Let's pass it on to Jesse from Magnolia Project.
Jesse.
I'm not sure we can hear you yet, Jesse.
I'm an idiot. It was on mute. It's okay. We're here for it. It's okay. So I was saying, I think that my friends have covered quite a bit. I do think, however, I have a slightly different perspective in some areas, just because being an independent organization, I think it's a little bit different from your high school organization. This is the first year I haven't taught high school, but anywho, so I think as directors, our timeline is pretty much year round, and like most people, before the current season ends, I pretty much know exactly what I want to do. We start talking about it like mid-season, going, before the end of that season, so that way we kind of have a sense of like who's coming back, the growth of the program, and that was another bullet point that I had. I choose my show direction a lot based on the needs of the program. So based on like maybe who's coming back, or doing a level up from the previous year. While I have like an extensive catalog, like everybody else in my phone, of like dream shows and all these things, sometimes that's just not it's just not going to fit the group of kids that you have. And so a lot of my decisions are based on where I think we need to go as a program, and based on where I feel like I can get the kids by April. And sometimes, like an initial thought or an initial idea is too big for where I can realistically get kids by April. Sorry, that was my phone going off. And that also, which I know is the next question, but that also determines my training program. So as far as the timeline, of course, before the end of the Winter Guard season, if not almost immediately after, we know pretty much what we're going to do for the following year. And then, but as we're brainstorming ideas, we kind of throw out, these are the kind of props that I'm seeing. This is the kind of color palette that I'm seeing. And then I kind of filter through all of those things. And again, from a director perspective, you kind of have to decide if it's even feasible. Because I do have a lot of choreographers that come in sometimes and they're like, we should do Six Flags, and I can't afford a roller coaster, so that also has a big impact. But it doesn't mean that you can't fully fulfill the idea that you're putting out there. So the show that I picked was our most recent year, because to be honest, every year is my favorite year, but my goal is for us to grow in that capacity every year, which is why I think every new year is my favorite, because I get to watch the Magnolia Project, these kids, like I get to watch them really like latch on to the growth that I envision for them, and they buy in, and it's just really exciting. So I think that's why every year is my favorite year. But of course, like just specifically for this, I there's not a lot of staff that I have. I did a lot of this year by myself. But from the beginning, I knew that I wanted to do the show. I knew that I wanted to do Remember When. And it was kind of my husband, Nick. You guys have seen him. It's kind of, he was really the only one that kind of like jumped on board from the beginning, because if you all remember, if you've seen it, it's a very quiet soundtrack. It's very low key. It's very one dimensional, which then requires your cast to have to pull off the other half of the sheets, because you don't have these big impactful musical moments. So you have to rely on the performance quality. You have to rely on the choreography. You have to rely on the drill design. You have to rely on this other part of the package to kind of sell, you know, what it is that you're selling. And so, but I knew it was a risk, and I knew it was a risk that I wanted to take, because I hadn't really seen that in A class before. You know, where somebody took a soundtrack that did, like Doug had mentioned, it didn't have peaks and valleys, you know. And so what we ended up doing with the design is that it started off with the female voice, which was Saber. Then it turned into the male voice, which was Rifle. And then when we got to the third part of the show, and we had Flag in the beginning, but then once we got to the third part of our show, we, you know, pulled in all of the parts, because it became a duet. So we had somebody picking up the female voice, the male voice, and the melodic line. And again, this is a question that I think is later on in the session, but that has a whole lot to do with your DA and both of your GE captions. And it did take me a little while to really fully understand your upstairs captions, but I think once you understand that, that has a whole lot to do with your show choice as well, because then you can really determine how far you can kind of go with that. And then I think, let me see. And then my tangible timeline, I think, is pretty much the same as everybody else's. I reach out to our soundtrack designer. Luckily, this past year, we didn't have to have like a soundtrack engineer, because we just ripped the music straight from YouTube, like start to finish. We didn't have to add anything, which is not typical of me. I'm crazy and a very difficult person, and normally we have like all the bells and whistles. I don't know if you all remember the year before this past year, the Trailer Park Show, and that was a big to-do. But that, I usually start on that kind of first, because your soundtrack really does, although it develops throughout the season, it really sets the tone for the rest of your package. You know, as far as like your visual package, and then as far as like your staging and choreography, you know, it really does set the tone. So that's kind of where I go first. And then kind of from there, you know, I'll work on costumes, and I usually work with Tommy. He and I have worked together for years, Tommy Keenum. And I really enjoy working with him, because he takes the designs that I have in my brain and is able to put it on paper. And I think that has a lot to do with, it has a lot to do with all of your captions, really. So I think just in terms of design and concept, you know, those tangible things are kind of just as important, really, as everything else. It's a very tedious, I think, concoction, maybe, you know, to kind of, it really, for a long time, I didn't really understand, like, the groups that are at the top and stay at the top. And then I think once I figured out their kind of, like, method of how you put everything together, really, and how you kind of just let things flow, is really when I was able to start being at least moderately successful. It takes some time, and I've tried multiple different things, and I guess that's one thing too, like, there isn't an exact method or timeline because the ultimate goal is always to get to the right answer, I guess. And sometimes things have to change in order for you to get to the right answer. And then, of course, as far as like soundtracks, that's going to change all year long. Like, luckily, again, we didn't have to deal with that this past year. But sometimes you do. If it doesn't really fit your pacing track that you kind of set at the beginning for yourself, you either decide like, this is the vision that I have and I want to stick with that. And so the XYZ has to change, or you change things based on, how things develop. But I think as far as my timeline, that was pretty much my timeline. My general timeline as far as like costumes and soundtracks and stuff like that is pretty much the same as everybody else's. But I really do try to get that stuff done as early as possible. I try to have all of those things finalized before our auditions. In September, we usually audition the 3rd and 4th week of September, and then our training season is October, November minus Thanksgiving, and then the first 2 weeks of December, and then by Christmas camp, we are putting on the real meat of our show. And that way, I've got at least 8 weeks to get the kids to the style that I need them to be at to be able to produce the show and ultimately the package that we want to see that year. But I think that's it as far as my timeline. So it's year round, I guess.
Yeah, so we see a lot of similarities, but also differences in the thought processes between independent and scholastic kind of groups. And that's just true with Lexus too. In the world's setting, we go through that soundtrack and modify that soundtrack constantly. Every weekend, talking about, do we need a couple more counts here? Do we need a new voiceover here? Do we need a new sound here? Do we need this, cue this? So that's soundtrack is constant. There's been very few successful seasons where we're able to just pull something and use it. There has been one or two, but often we're adding or pulling or adding a small space or something. So yeah. Okay, wonderful. I had 5 topics to discuss, and much of what has already been discussed covers those topics, but here's one that we haven't really hit. So we're going to start with Bethany, and then we'll hear from Jesse and then Doug on this one. But when you're considering your training process and you get your kids in your gym, you got your show set, you know what your concept is, you know what it's going to look like and what they're going to be wearing, what consideration do you give to their training so that you can bring this concept to life? So do you have any thoughts on that, Bethany? And then you can just pass it right to Jesse when you're finished.
Awesome. My training process, I honestly stick to about the same training process as I always do. So we start with our basics, and we do our basics every single day. Make sure everybody has them down, making sure that we can do just like drop spins, double time, even on flag doing double time, like trying to get our wrists flexible so that whatever is thrown at them, they can just do whatever I can whenever we start choreographing everything. Whenever especially when we do across the floors, because when I have my show design, if I know that there's going to be big moves, then like I try to give them a working across the floor that's going to get them from here to there and like so many counts, but give them so much space also. With the training process, I also I feel like with every show, everybody kind of has their own like their little motif. Like they have like a little extra free arm that matches their show, or have like a underbody or something that they constantly do in the show that's gonna always be clean. So if I know that that's there, I'm gonna always try to give that to them as early as I can. I always try to find that like little like motif move for the season, whether it's dance or flag, whatever, so that it can transfer to all 3 or to 4, I guess, honest. But other than that, it's just sticking to our basics, and then as long as they can do their backhands, they can do their tosses, then everything's fine.
Me?
Yep.
Okay. So I think again, for us, it's just a little bit different. We do, of course, have very standard, parts of the training program, but our show design really pushes the training program. Like with two other of my students, we're already working on like revamping our like dance training program and the weapon book before we hit winter, so that by the time we hit auditions, the warm-ups and things like that we're teaching are already based off of our show concept. And one, we do it so early because at auditions, we need to know if you're going to be able to do because there are kids that that you can get there by April, and then there are some that have less than zero experience with the style, and so you kind of that also helps me morph the training program so that we can get everybody on the same page. So the show concept and design that we're going to do for that current year really does dictate our training program for that year, because it's so stylistic, and especially in the A class, they want to see so much on the sheets. In A class, they want to see you pushing the boundary, but they want to see you in this box. They want to see you hitting the top of that box, but they want to see like hints of open class, or that box, like top of box 5, so you've got to be able to like push that boundary a little bit, and push the skill set of the kids, and I kind of used that approach even to when I was teaching high school students as well, because, and again, this might be another or a different question, it might be related to this. You don't want to do your kids a disservice when they're ready to move on from your program and you've taught them one style, one skill set, one thing, especially if they want to continue, they want to be prepared. And that has a lot to do with what we choose to do from year to year as well, because I want to give the kids as expansive of an opportunity, as they can, without drowning trying to learn something new and different. But our show design definitely dictates our audition process and our training program. And then, like I said previously, from auditions, from the end of September, our training program runs strictly October, November minus Thanksgiving, and the first 2 weeks of December, and then we have Christmas camp. And then by the time we hit Christmas camp, there is no more like development of skill set. And that's just something, and it might be a flaw in me as an educator, but I learned a long time ago that there comes a point where you can't keep trying to pull things out of kids. You have to work on excellence. You have to be able to work on what they're going to look like at the end of the season, and judges don't want to see trying by the time you reach that stage. If we're doing quads with like a hair flip, they have to look like they do that in their sleep, and so that's why it dictates how we audition kids. It dictates our training program. It dictates who makes what line. And if there's 3 kids on a part, there's 3 kids on a part. But in A class, you only have to have 3 kids on a part to get credit for it. So that's always something that I've kind of held in my back pocket. I'm like, well, these 3 will throw that Milford sit roll. But and it's as simple as that for us, really. That's just kind of how we dictate our training program and our audition process.
I think for us, for both places, both Ryle and Milford, we have our set, obviously, basics that we are constantly doing, year round, really. I think the important thing is that we are always, every year, looking to expand those and add to that range and variety in our basics. And our approach to that is to always be adding something that we can pull from, right? So obviously, you have your basic sautés and things like that across the floors, but let's do some combinations of things that we could potentially pull to put into the show, right? And then the second piece to that is really taking that once you get into your show, and can we make, there's, for example, in it actually worked out that it was an across the floor, and then we just expanded the across the floor. But in Ryle's show, right towards the end, before we started building our flag feature, there was 2 lines, and they were at the props, and there was this big follow the leader dance feature, right? And when we got to that point and we knew that it was going to be a dance feature, we were like, this is the perfect opportunity for this across the floor we've been working on. And the kids handle that across the floor fairly well. So we throw that in, and obviously that across the floor wasn't long enough, so we had to expand upon it, right? So then what we do from that point is take that across the floor, and now we expand that across the floor in our basics so that it's exactly matching, and so that our basics are expanding and cleaning the show for us at the same time. And we kind of do the same thing with equipment. A lot of times, instead of just, once we get into the show season, once we start taking, we have tosses with our hair flips, or we have, sit rolls, whatever it may be, whatever it is that you're working on, we end up, whether it's a free arm or body or whatever underneath of it, that we end up taking those. We call them show tosses. So in our schedule for the day, we'll start switching, right? So instead of just doing our normal pop toss exercise, we're going to take our pop toss where we're going down to the knees in technique block now, because it's in your show. And so kind of expanding that throughout the season to match what we're doing. Obviously, we're teaching them those kinds of skills throughout the season, but really kind of as the season really starts to gear up, and it's different obviously with Jessie, because she has to know that those kids can do it through auditions. We kind of on the high school side have to get them there. So we're kind of teaching it and hoping they get it, and then putting it into the show when we have an idea that they get it, and then really kind of packaging our technique around what's in the show, so that we're both expanding ourselves and really cleaning the show for yourself through your basics.
Yeah, awesome. That's definitely a strategy that I've used for a long time at Lexus, especially with the show we did that was Charlotte's Magnum Opus. It was the spider themed show, and the one before that was
it was my favorite.
Yeah, that was my favorite. One of my favorites also. It was just that I researched these dance programs that were out of the Netherlands that had done this entire 30 minutes on like a 30-minute performance, and it was about the spider, and I used so many of the body shapes from that and trained it into our body warm-up. So we were doing that body warm-up every weekend 3 or 4 times. And so when we had a blank spot, we're like, hey, we need something right here, and it was just the kids already knew it. They already were in tune with this style of movement. We could pull 16 counts from their warm-up. We did the same in For the Boys, and we did the same in Bonnie and Clyde. And for Lexus, those were our 3 most successful scoring programs, and all that training came right out of the body warm-up, honestly. So instead of just standard plies, we put all this style into the shaping of the lines of the body, in plie, tendu, that kind of stuff, turns across the floors, which made the transition of our technique into our program become much more stylized. So definitely a strategy that's worth looking into. Takes time to develop and a lot of thought and research, but it's worth it. Awesome. So that kind of concludes our discussion from our panelists. If anybody wants to ask a question, we can leave it open to that for a second. If you want to say who you're asking the question to and just shoot out a question there.
I have a question. I'll start.
Okay, Doug.
How much does your initial show idea, your vision, change by the time that you actually start, getting into it?
Mine specifically changes constantly. Like I have my initial pacing outlined. This is what I want to have happen. This is the mood or the vibe or the storyline that I want to portray. But a lot of times, based on like something random that a choreographer says, or that like a member will, like, I'll watch kids like randomly, they're just messing around out there doing something. I'm like, wait a minute. And that'll dictate like a whole 15-second, chunk. Or on the flip side of that, like, I had envisioned, we worked on this a lot this year. So our part 1 stayed exactly the same from the very beginning of the season to the very end of the season. Parts 2 and 3 changed a lot. And I had this vignette idea that I wanted to see happen, and I wasn't like okay with it until we achieved it. So we went through multiple versions of it to try to, make it work until eventually we got to the right one. But mine, and I'm a very type A person, so it took me a number of years to accept that things are going to change from weekend to weekend, or in your case, from rehearsal to rehearsal. But once I accepted that and really started trusting the people around me and letting them get their ideas out before I made a judgment about it, it honestly really like propelled us into the right direction. Because, as directors, like, while we are skilled at designing and teching and choreographing and training, you can't do 100% of all of the things. So when you do have the team around you where this person can do 100% of the choreography, this person can do 100% of the training, this person can do 100% of, this part or that part, and you guys can like really work together, I don't really see like the morphing as an issue, because ultimately with each thought and idea, you're growing, you're going in a different direction, you're not staying stagnant. You don't want to end up at the end of the season with the show you premiered with.
Yeah, it's the same for me. I'll answer my own question.
It changes a lot.
Yeah, so I can tell you, like, for example, the Milford show, the original intent, we knew instantly that we wanted to have the floor completely covered in leaves, but the original intent was to be like 2 inches thick in leaves, to where like every step it was just blowing up by the end, right? And so that kind of obviously led us to the raised floor in order to keep it all in and things like that. But as we were putting more leaves out and putting more leaves out and paying for those and seeing like, oh God, instead of the math that we did where we thought it would be 150,000, it's probably closer to $1 million that we need, and that wasn't doable, right? And then other things like slipping and falling on them, right? Because they are very slippery on a floor, kind of altered that, and so we kind of had to change gears, right, at that last second. And then the same thing for Ryle. The original show idea was actually about a painting that we were going to kind of break apart and change and completely put a new painting together. And as we like started working through that in our heads and how we do that with props and all of the logistics of trying to get like, okay, well this prop's gonna we're gonna have to know specifically where every prop is gonna go. We decided that it was too restrictive, right? Like it was gonna cause us to force ourselves to do all these X, Y, and Z things to make it happen. And so we were like, let's just make it very general, right? And we kind of totally shifted the idea of the show. So totally am in the same boat. It like never usually ends up being what it was.
Right.
And, like you were talking about equipment, like I remember we wrote our flag feature at Ryle, and it was like we were like, I really do not, like this is Scholastic A, I don't want to have a 5-minute show. We were at like 4 minutes and 48 seconds, and I was like we have to make
Ensemble
it work.
8 counts.
Right. So we did it, and just we sat on it for about a week, and as a staff, we just sat there and said, like, this isn't right? This doesn't feel like a moment for us that's memorable. And so we made the decision, like, we're going to take the risk, we're going to make the show longer, we're going to add that time in so that we can fulfill all of that in. And so I think it's like, like you said, like as a director, you have that eye, but like relying on yourself, but also relying on everybody around you to like view the program and have an honest opinion. My staff and I, we literally will create a list right away, right? We stage the first half of the show, whatever it is, and we're already starting to say like, okay, this may or may not work. We need to keep an eye on it. So we kind of start creating this checklist throughout the season of things that we'd like to alter or we need to keep an eye on and making to adjust. Start tossing back and forth ideas on how to achieve that without having to obviously blow everything up. So I think just kind of having that eye throughout the season, like don't force yourself like, well, it's already done. I don't want to have to go back and make that edit. Like, it's okay to make edits.
It's okay to make the edit. It's
use
okay
that eraser.
to make the edit. My kids say they laugh at me all the time because the ones I still have kids in Magnolia that have been with me for like the last 7 years that I've watched from like 8th grade, and they're like, Jesse will literally, if the flag raise isn't right, like on Championships Day, we will be reworking that flag raise because it's not over till it's over. And like, don't just settle for just because you don't want to change it. And if you're not capable, heck, bring in a second set of eyes. Like maybe you just need to take this out, or maybe you just need to add a cone or a turnaround here, you know, to make it a little bit more musically effective, you know, or check a couple extra boxes like on the sheets. But, you know, and that's especially with drill design, it's very hard. Like when you get boxed in and you're like, this isn't working, but I don't really know why, and I can't really fix it, you know, is when like, that's when I kind of just, because I thought once upon a time I could wear all the hats and do all the things. And then I realized I don't want to. Like, I'm not great at all of the things. I'm really good at being a director and like delegating and dictating and like, this isn't right, but I'm not entirely certain why, but I know that like Kalina can come in and fix that. I know the boys, which are Sean and Miles, we call them the boys, like they'll have a totally different perspective and fix something like that took me like 45 minutes to get frustrated with and just walk away from, you know. And it's, I don't know, like once you start really just hearing other people and really fully relying on, you know, not just trusting yourself, but also like magical things can happen. It's crazy.
Totally agree.
Well, y'all, we have kind of come to the end of our hour here, so I just want to say thank you again to Bethany and Jesse and Doug for joining us this evening and being panelists. And then also, if everybody give them a round of applause. If we were live in person, you would get a standing ovation right now. Oh, Tyler has raised his hand. Well, go for it, Tyler. What you got?
An accident. I'm so sorry.
Thank you for joining us. Then the other thing is thank everyone for joining us this evening. I hope that you found it to be informational, educational, and just I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to expand your mind and listen to some other folks who are outstanding models in our circuit. I just want to let everybody know that July 6th, we will have our next evening, 7:30 p.m. It's going to be about technique that supports the choreography that you want to put in your program and making sure that that technique training program aligns with your sheet that you're trying to put out a guard on. So we'll have Shelby Thompson with us, who is here tonight. Thank you. Amanda Morris with us, who is also here tonight, but I think she's peaced out, and Jocelyn Wilson. So 3 incredible instructors in our circuit who always put out really incredible programs with some really strong choreography that's based out of technique, which is on a lot of our sheets. So I hope you can join us that evening. I also want to let you know August 3rd, we're going to talk about some judging materials and how to read those sheets with some guests, Dana Arnold, Kalina Thompson, and Dawn Deems, who all judge in our circuit. So if you can put on your calendar to see us on Thursday, July 6th or August 3rd, we would love to have you come to those. And if there's any feedback you have that you want to share, things you want to see be different, you're welcome to fill out the form collecting data on this. And also you're welcome to email me at education@tristatemarchingarts.org. I'd love to hear your feedback and also to try to design sessions that best meet the needs of the people in our circuit. So thank you. Share this experience, and I appreciate everyone attending.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you all.
Doug shared that that Google Doc with. Can we get that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
I
We'll
haven't
just
seen
leave
if I
on
saw
here
a
if
bunch of
anybody else has
spelling
anything else. Just wanted to make sure we gave a formal shout out to our folks here and appreciation and your future opportunities. So if you want to hang out and have a conversation, let's do it.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.